I'm Tony Ruiz of Gold Derby here with Jay Wadley, the composer behind the new Apple TV Plus limited series Franklin, starring Michael Douglas as Benjamin Franklin. And Jay, I feel like that for an assignment like this has to be something that's completely unlike anything you've ever done. I mean, would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, on a multitude of levels. I mean, really from a just like size of a project and like the amount of music that needed to be written and in the amount of time, it was just like such a large ship to steer, and there were a lot of learning experiences, but all of the things that I've done along the many years I've been doing this to be able to manage a project of this size and be able to output 4.5 hours of full orchestral music, fully recorded, mixed, mastered in 6 months. It was, I put in the time and energy of all those years to organize myself to be able to manage such a thing. But yeah, so that was the biggest new thing for me, because I've done a fair amount of scores that have used orchestra, and that's my background. I studied classical music composition, and so I'm very comfortable with it. But never in my life have I written 4.5 hours. In probably total in my entire life have I ever written 4.5 hours of orchestral music. So I over doubled my output in 6 months. My entire life output in 6 months, I guess. So there you go.
Well, well, but when you get an assignment like this, where does your process begin? I can't even imagine. Are you looking at footage and that inspires it, or is it the time period? Where do you begin?
Yeah, I mean they sent me the scripts to read, and by the time I came on, there was already some picture. They were done shooting, they were editing, and they had been for a while. And so thankfully I did kind of come in, which I actually kind of prefer to get started once there's actual footage for me to see, and edits are starting to come together, so I can just because the way that things look on a page and the way that I read the tone on a page it's different than what you actually end up seeing on screen, and nuanced performances from the actors can change things, and big production value and all of that stuff. It's just so important to kind of see that and be able to match that and play off of that. So yeah, so I came in. Yeah, they had already had a couple edits, and I just honestly, it's one of the first projects that I just kind of started at the top and wrote the first two cues in the series. Those were my first cues out the gate, and so I went through a whole interview process, and I've worked with the music supervisor before, and I was friends with the music editor, and all of those things, which certainly help when it comes to like securing a job, because they're like, we know that Jay could handle this, so they were on my team, and yeah, met with Tim Van Patten, who was just like an incredible leader, and just one of those like very generous people who is very collaborative and very clear and very open and responsive, and yeah, great communicator. So it was an incredible process. So I got to interview with him, and we hit it off. We talked about a lot of like concert music references more so than anything else, and yeah, and then there I was, and I was off to the races.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up the concert music
Yeah,
thing, because this is so of a period. It is
yeah,
so specific, and I think a lot of people who don't know a lot about classical music don't realize the breadth that can happen even within a single period. So, what were kind of
sure.
the touchstones for you in terms of how this was going to sound?
Yeah. Well, I knew that the visual language of it was going to be, a very modern cinematic approach. But like, Tim talked about it being very kind of gritty and dirtier than what you would typically see how people present these kind of sort of period pieces, and in a bit more glamour than was reality. He was like, Paris was dirty. It was smelly, and the wig smelled terrible, and it was so like trying to capture a little bit of that sort of grit in the score. So thinking about that in terms of how the composition would play out, and playing up the drama and the sort of tension in the high stakes of everything. But as far as like the more period sounding things, those were pieces that I kind of you know I came to the conclusion that I wanted to treat a lot of the comedy elements with things that like leaned more period, because that felt like lighter and more appropriate for comedy, and without like going too far into like what you would typically expect with like humorous comedy music, and like where that can get kind of cheesy and cheapen the production overall. So I was trying to keep it pretty like elevated in that way, and so with the track "Try Harder" on the album, that's one of the pieces that I wrote, obviously with like a Vivaldi like late Baroque kind of approach in mind, and uh, to try to draw some attention to how sort of florid and ornamented all of these spaces were, and those scenes were as like Temple was kind of assimilating into French culture and being like taken from rags, wearing what they essentially saw as rags into fancy French clothing with wigs and all of the yeah, the show of it all, I guess, so that's kind of how I was trying. I was thinking, oh, well, this feels appropriate because it's so elaborate and ornamented and like busy, and there's, so and like fun. It could be dramatic and fun simultaneously. Um, so yeah.
Well, and you mentioned Vivaldi there, and I wonder, when you're doing a piece that's of an era like this, and you have such very clear influences
Yeah.
um, from some of these composers, is there a danger? Is there a tightrope walk that you have to do between drawing inspiration from that to mimicking it? I feel like there would have to be like a needle that you have to kind of thread with that.
Yeah, I mean, like I don't, as far as pre-existing, like as far as like old school composers, I like if anyone was fooled by my by me, that was actually Vivaldi, then I'd be proud. But I think I mean, I think that's a good question, but in this like in this sort of type of circumstance, when you're dealing with like period music, I think as long as it feels authentic to most ears, like then I was successful, and so there are elements that I'm obviously borrowing from uh Vivaldi of that time, because that's how strings music was written in that sort of way, and those sort of gestures and those sort of chordal movements. So it's imitation, and I think that's totally fine. That's how composers learn to begin with, as they get started in their careers. Is you find people that you latch onto, that you admire, that are in late careers, and you're like, oh, I want to be like that. And so you start writing music, that is heavily influenced from those things. But I think you get creative. I think if that's what you're doing in the language of like film scoring in general, you need to find your own voice. You need to find your own way, and not just like try to sound like somebody else. But I think there's a lot of learning to be had in the early stages of your career by learning to write in the style of different people. I mean, that's part of the compositional exercises in school. That's part of, you're studying other people's music, and but then you take that, you ingest it, you interpret it, and it's never going to be an exact replica. You know what I mean? Even like if let's call that my best Vivaldi, there's going to be choices that I made that he wouldn't have made, and like those may make it sound like it, so it'll be Vivaldi-esque, and but like it'll always have a little bit of me because I made my choices. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. Obviously you don't want to be just like copying people. If this is like, okay, I'm establishing my sound as a film composer, so I'm gonna just like take from everyone else and do that. But like, I think in these types of situations, especially with period things, like, yeah, there's an element of you learn from the masters, and there's some imitation there.
So when it comes to the actual, like, particularly when you're writing things for a full orchestra,
Yeah.
um, what is that first time recording, when you actually are hearing it played with all these pieces? How big was the orchestra?
The orchestra was pretty large, 40 strings, 8 winds, 10 brass, percussion, piano, harp, celeste, harpsichord. Um,
God, I
uh,
love the harpsichord so much. I love the
yeah,
harpsichord so much.
yeah, and then soloists, solo violin and solo cello, and that I did here in my studio. But pretty much everything else was done at Ocean Way in Nashville, with the great musicians down there, and they really killed it. And yeah, I mean, it's such a blessing when you get that opportunity to do that. That's what I got into it for, is working with live musicians and enjoying that process. And unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to actually go down and be in the sessions, because I was so busy working on the projects themselves. But uh, or like on the next cues, just like constantly churning. So I would dial in from New York and watch the session, and I had a talkback mic where I could, like, talk directly with the conductor and the orchestra and give them notes and ideas and all of that, and listening in real time and watching it with picture. But yeah, it's always nice when you get to go down there. I got to go down there and conduct my own stuff when I did the Kaufman film, I'm Thinking of Ending Things. So I conducted that, and I love conducting when I can. But yeah, but the amount of music that we had to get through, and all the preparation that had to go into it, we had to, divide and conquer.
Well, you talk about technology, and I'm curious. When I talk to composers, there's a kind of this running theme about how technology has kind of changed. Not just the way music is made, but the way it's recorded, and the way technology's kind of found is become another instrument. And I'm curious, in a period piece like this, what role does technology play in kind of your process?
I mean, it definitely plays a role in being able to, certainly demo out, even though we were able to go and, like, record with a full orchestra, which was a gift. My demos sounded pretty realistic, to be honest. And like, it's crazy what you can do in a studio, and like when you have samples. And I would bring in a violinist to play on the top line, and it sounded pretty close to what the final one did. Obviously, it takes it from here to just like here when you hear it with the real orchestra, but like it would be passable in a lot of cases, for a real orchestra. Like, a lot of people probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So that's an interesting thing, but that helps, like, being able to sell ideas through, for sure. And then, also just being able to do things quicker at scale, being able to, yeah, dial in and listen in real time and with lock picture. Like, I'd be like, that would just add days of traveling and costs associated with that if I had to be there. And it just can't get done on the same timeline if yeah. So if there's not for that, yeah.
You don't have time to just sit on it with a piece of paper and write treble clef, E flat.
Surprisingly not. I think that, like, honestly would have taken me 10 years to get there.
Well, I was looking through kind of your background, and you've had such a diverse background. You mentioned, I'm Thinking of Ending Things. You worked on the score to Fire Island,
Yep.
and so I'm curious what guides your choices. Is it the variety that guides your choices?
I do like challenges and new projects and things that kind of pique my interest, that are outside of what maybe I typically do. But um, you know, I have an eye. I think I have an eye on what I like, where I want to be focusing. But as a young composer, and like, I'm maybe outside of the line of young composer now, that I've turned 40. But like, really, it's so funny. Like, a lot of young composer competitions, I think, is like the cutoff's like 39. So it's like So that tells you what the average age of a composer is. But like it's I think uh, for me, I know where I want to be heading and focusing on creatively, and I always am up for a challenge for things outside of that, and up for collaborations with people that I find particularly interesting. So most projects that I take on, are relationships that I've established over many years, of people that I love and love to work with, and always have a great time being creative with. And so yeah, you know, like yeah, so that's kind of how I make my decisions. Is like, do I like the creative direction of this project? Do I think I have something interesting to add, and that my voice will be able to come through and lift up this project? And then it's like, who are the people involved? Do I enjoy working with them? Because like you're in the trenches with on these projects, so it can be rough if you don't enjoy working with the people. So it's a big deciding factor.
Well, Jake, congratulations! Such beautiful work. I've been listening to the soundtrack for elements of it for the last few days and leading up
Thanks.
to that. And so, congratulations, everybody! To go to goldderby.com, make your predictions for the upcoming award season. Stay tuned for interviews with more contenders in the coming weeks. Jay Wadley from Franklin, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.